It's the Steve Padilla Sessions, episode 3, with me, Kevin Pang of America's Test Kitchen, Baxter Holmes, senior writer at ESPN covering the NBA, and of course, Los Angeles Times column 1 editor, and in our opinion, the best writing coach in America, Steve Padilla. Gentlemen, always a treat to talk the writing craft with you two. And this week we decided we were going to be discussing structure. And I want to begin our conversation with a prompt, which is specifically narrative structure. So in its simplest form, and the way that I learned it in journalism school, is conflict and resolution. A protagonist wants something, something gets in the protagonist's way, he or she finds some way through hell or high water to get that thing. Does that sound about right to you guys?
The mystery writer who just died, John Le Carre, am I pronouncing that right? He said, he had this line that summarized what you just said, Kevin. He said, the cat sat on a mat is not a story. The cat sat on another cat's mat is a story. Anyway, I just always thought that kind of embodied conflict right there.
Yeah. What is your definition, Steve, when especially when beginning writers, come up to you in the newspaper world, we seem to think, any grandma who sews a quilt, is the Sunday Bright, as we like to call it, right? And it took a long time for me to unlearn what makes a story and to see stories as something that has an arc in it. So I would love to hear how you think about narrative structure.
Well, I think one thing is I look for, is there any sort of, is there a story? I mean, in other words, is there development? Is there change? Do you start in one place and end up in another? And that could literally be physically, you start in Chicago and you end up in LA. It could be emotionally. It could be change of life. It could be, being single and then becoming married. I just wonder, is there some sort of journey? Is it trying out for the team and then being drafted by the Clippers? I'm always looking for, essentially what I'm looking for journeys. And I use the word in the broadest sense, like I said, literally physical, emotional, psychological journey. And they can transpire over, months, years, but also they could transpire in an afternoon. I mean, I don't think, so many times when I hear people talk about narrative writing, they say, long form narrative. It doesn't have to be long, to be a narrative at all. One of the best narratives I edited at the Times is about, I think it was maybe 330 words long, and it described a body being brought back from Iraq, by a military plane and returned to the family. And that was essentially the whole narrative.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm looking for some sort of transformation. Baxter, is that what you look for?
Honestly, yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking, well, first, the way that you broke it down, Kevin, I felt, maybe that is what is taught in schools and is the proper formulaic way to think about it, like conflict resolution, whatnot. But Steve, when you said the word journey, that's probably the way that I've thought about it. And I know I should read, I think there's some different books about narrative arc. And one of them, I think, is called like Writing for Story that some of my friends have recommended. Yeah. But I think about journey. But I think about journey. It's like, where is this story trying to go? And change is a big part of it, right? So it could be, if something happened to someone, you're showing, or to a place or whatever, you're showing it maybe before, then you're showing the thing happened, and then you're showing like kind of what it became. Like I just finished Midnight in Chernobyl, and obviously that journey is before the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, and then what happened during it, and then what happened after it. So it's like following the sense of change. So I'm often thinking about that, like, what is the journey? Change is a key word. And then it really just depends on maybe what the story is about. But beyond that, I don't, that journey and change is a starting point for me. And it's probably, as with all things I know about writing, I can trace it back to Steve.
Well, thank you. And I'm thinking now of, earlier today, I was talking to our Houston bureau chief, Molly Hennessy Fisk. And so now I'm thinking about a literally journey story she did after one of the floods that hit Louisiana a few years ago. And the narrative was a guy getting into a boat. Yeah, it was in a boat. It wasn't a canoe. It was a boat, and it had a power. Yeah, it had an engine, and so a little power boat, and it goes through this flooded Louisiana neighborhood to get to his house, and the whole tension was, would it be flooded or not? Would it be destroyed or not? That was the tension, and one of the things is, one way to write that story is to say at the very beginning, the house was destroyed, and then have him arrive. But she didn't, you kept, the whole tension was what's going to happen. And we went on the trip. And I remember one of the great details was the boat is going through this, flooded street, and the water is up halfway up past the, halfway up the telephone poles and things. And it bumps the boat. And the guy said, "Oh, that must have been a mailbox," which I thought was just a great detail. Anyway, you didn't know what it was going to be, and then it turned out the house survived. It had a happy ending, but you didn't know that.
Go ahead, Bax.
Well, one thing I was going to say real quick, as much as I think journey and change, I have are like driving forces with how to think about narrative arc. The thing that Steve just mentioned has become maybe the driving force for me over the last like 4 or 5 years, and it's just tension. And I think that I want to say it was Kurt Vonnegut said something to the effect of like, the main character always there has to be something they want. It could be just a glass of water, but they have to want something. There has to be something that they're kind of going after. And I've thought about like tension, not giving away too much too soon, kind of raising the stakes as a way, even if maybe the stakes aren't necessarily that high, but as a way of trying to keep the reader locked into the story, right? Which is our ultimate thing. So as much as journey and change are the thing, it's like, okay, how can I create a tension point that can carry through the story? And maybe there's a reveal at the end, or there's reveals at different points along the way. But like, Steve, as you mentioned tension, maybe tension is the driving point.
Well, I find that so often editors, we ask, writers, move it up. I'm one of the ones who says, move it down, because I think sometimes we give away too much. But one thing I wanted to share with you guys, or I'm sure we've talked about this before, is I have this theory that there's two kinds of narratives. And that when I hear people say, I want to write a narrative, my thought is, well, what kind? In other words, is the purpose, what is the meaning of the story? Is the purpose the journey, or is the purpose the destination? So to me, in the journey story, we already know the ending. We know the killer was captured. We know the operation was a success. We know the Lakers won the game, but we read the story to find out why and how this happened. The other kind of journey story or narrative, I think, is the destination one. We don't know the ending. We don't know, will they catch the killer? Will the thing be a success? Kevin, your story about the award winner about the chef opening the restaurant in Chicago, Grace, and which, folks, if you haven't read, you should. That, in many ways, was a destination story, because we didn't know where that was going. You didn't give away a lot of key things up high.
Well, and we'll actually talk about both our stories here today. But one thing about that particular story, which was the story is called His Saving Grace, and it was published in the Chicago Tribune in, oh my God, 2013. So 8 years. Well, very kind. Thanks for the plug. I get no royalties, by the way, Steve.
Okay, yes, but it's in this book. Yeah.
But the thing about that story is that the I guess the destination is that we know that the chef, whose name is Curtis Duffy, is going to open a restaurant, and he has it's about and in that case, what happens is I actually give away the ending. It's a destination story, but probably not in the way that you mean it. But it's
you're actually right. You do give away the ending.
However, the destination is that there is a person who has a specific reservation at 9:30 p.m. that night. And this person is really, really important to the chef. And there's a reason why she is there on that night. And, the story of why she's so important, that is the destination, but there's also the journey part of the story as well. So it's all,
and he doesn't, and you don't give away her name. All we know is that there's this important table at this important reservation at 9:30 on this night, but we don't know who it is, let alone know why it's important.
I want to dive back into one of the earlier points, because that we can actually dovetail into a longer discussions about each of these stories. But you mentioned how in the journey story, the journey narrative, we wanted this. It's about the why and the how, and I want to dive into that a little bit about, how do we keep readers compelled with just the why and the how?
Oh, well, I think if the tales are cool, I mean, in fact, I think that tends to be more the more typical thing for newspaper journalism. We already know, like I say, the killer was captured or something. You actually see these kind of headlines often in papers. How they literally say with the word, they begin with the word how. How this legislation was passed through Congress, how scientists developed the coronavirus vaccine. And it promises you that you're going to go literally on a journey. And the trick is having really interesting details for the journey, and to skip over the boring stuff. I was reminded today, in fact, I had to look it up to get the right reference, is in about what to leave out in a narrative. I think when people hear narrative, they think that means you have to do like every step in the process, and you don't. And one I remember, and I know Baxter, I know we talked about this famous Gary Smith's piece from Sports Illustrated called Damned Yankee. Or maybe we didn't talk about it. It's a profile of a guy who'd been a successor to Yogi Berra as the Yankees catcher, a guy named John Malagone.
I'm going to put it on my shelf right now, so you keep talking, okay?
Okay, you got it. Okay, so to simplify it, it basically concerns this guy John. That's it. Yeah.
This book is, if you don't have this book, Beyond the Game, The Collected Sports Writing, Gary Smith, is just, I think it's dog-eared. I've read this so many times. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's
I have it on my shelf. It's amazing. Yeah, can't recommend it.
Unfortunately, I have it at my office and I can't get in there right now. But so in that story, essentially, this childhood trauma happens to this guy John that affects his whole life. And the basic gimmick of the story is he has this childhood trauma, and it leads to him just blowing it with the Yankees, and his career ends after just a few years with the Yankees. But later in life, when he's in his 60s, he comes to terms with what happened when he was a kid. Okay, so the story tells you about what happened when he was a kid, talks about him as a young man playing for the Yankees, what happened, how he flamed out. And then there's this very short sentence, and it says, 32 years walked by. That's the whole sentence.
We have talked about this, yeah.
32 years walked by. And what I loved about it, and what I took away from that was, I think I would have felt compelled to have at least, 4 or 5 graphs talking about how he got married, had 3 kids, ran a plumbing business, bought a ranch style home. I would have felt compelled to fill in some of that middle portion. And Gary Smith just said 32 years walked by. And what I loved about that was those years aren't important. What's important is when he finally, at this older age, had this epiphany and started to come to terms with the trauma of his childhood. And so that I've definitely used more than once of, we don't have to say every step of the process. 32 years walked by. That was one of the big takeaways from that story.
I'm not sure this is analogous, but Miles Davis said it's not the notes you play, it's the notes that you don't play.
Bingo. Yeah.
Well, that's so much about the what great writing can be, right? It's like like you're having the reader kind of fill in gaps in your head. It's like you don't want everything on the page. You want to leave a little bit up to the imagination and stuff. So yeah, it's like, how can you say the most without, that's the essence of like great writing, it's like being in a concise way. I love that. 32 years. I remember when you were telling me about that over a lunch when I worked at the Times, and I just thought, I was like, wow, it was an epiphany thing, but it was a great lesson in that way. And Kevin, to your point about like the how and the why, I find that if a story, like I read this profile recently of an apple. It was an apple. It was like, it was genetically made. It had been in the works forever. They were trying to find the next Red Delicious bestseller in the state of Washington. And so they'd tried all these different clones and things like that. And they found this one. And the journey was like the beginning of how this apple was made. And then they're telling like the story of the apple industry all the way up to when it's going to hit store shelves and everything like that. And you could think like, well, you know, is a profile of an apple that interesting? But it was really a profile about an entire industry and how it works, and also about climate change and about science and how it can impact what we eat, and about all of these things. And so I tend to, I read a lot of things that are they're just things I didn't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Did it drive you forward, the story?
Absolutely. Like I didn't realize the stakes of how much money, time, and effort, and hope and faith had been placed into this apple. That this apple was going to carry an entire industry forward, but it was also kind of make or break in a way. It was this hope and faith and investment had been placed into it. So yeah, the stakes were high, but I think if you have to tell people something that they don't know. We do. So your point, Steve, earlier about like the how, we do a lot of stories where the headline is inside. So it's like inside the something scandal, or inside the something, which kind of sets the table on that you're going to be going behind the scenes and like into a subgenre or this whole other world. The curtain's going to be pulled back, and you're going to, and so that's it's a great way to do it. Although the inside and the how headlines can get overused, I think, at times. But
also it does mean that you have to deliver for the reader. I mean, the reporting has to be strong enough to really say, hey, look at this cool stuff I got.
Yeah. But if you really dive deep into something, I think the narrative, the narrative.
But I still think that when people do want to think of a narrative, that they should really think of this one fundamental question: is the principal mission of this the journey or the destination? There's a little overlap, but I think if you decide it's more of a destination story, that I want to keep the ending hidden, that'll influence what cats you let out of what bags, earlier on. If they already know the ending, you can create other forms of tension. So I just think it's really important to have that fundamental decision. Is it the ending, or is it the destination, or the journey? What's the main engine of this train here?
You brought up the story about the apple, which we'll link below in the description fields below on this video. But I was reminded there was a story, I was just looking it up just now, just to remind me, that ran in the Oregonian back in the late 90s called the French Fry Connection. And it was a famous story. It was written by a journalist named Richard Reed, and it was essentially a business story, an explanatory story, but the structural device of that piece was it tracked 20 tons of 20 tons of potatoes from an Oregon farm field to a fast food outlets in Asia. And so it's the journey of the potatoes that is used to tell, like, that is the structural engine for a story that is essentially a business story.
Yeah, we just had something like that ran maybe 2 weeks ago in the LA Times by Emily Baumgaertner, very, very grim topic, the journey of a body bag. These body bags being sewn in Thailand. And this one, we follow one bag from Thailand to Detroit, where it's used for a COVID victim. And the thing with these stories, though, is they sound great in concept, but they often can be boring because it's just an object, And so the key is having enough people doing stuff with, to or around the object to be interesting. And Emily succeeds in doing that. We can get the link for that one too, Kevin.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention something to you guys, a trick I've used on narratives. I forget if I ever shared this with you guys or not, but you ever have this, you've got essentially a narrative and it's not holding together, but you can't tell why. It's not like it's a disaster. It just feels weird for some reason. One trick I'll use is I'll make a printout and I just highlight the time elements.
Okay.
Not that chronological order solves every problem, but it solves a lot of them. And the first time I did it, I remember it vividly. It was a piece about I wasn't the main editor. The main editor, a guy named Sam Enriquez, who's now at the Wall Street Journal, asked me to look at this piece. And it was about a rich guy, formerly rich guy. He owned a car dealership and he pissed away his fortune. And there was something about it bothering Sam. And I read it and I noticed it had a lot of years. So I made a printout, circled all the years. And then I saw the pattern or the lack of the pattern. This guy slowly like went downhill, but you didn't appreciate that because the time elements were all mixed up. It wasn't chronological. The other revelation from the printout was that there was 1 year circled more than all the others. And it's weird that I can remember it was 1996. I can barely remember how to log on some days, but I can remember with this story, 1 year was circled more than all the others. But so that was the pivotal year in this narrative of this guy's life. But you didn't feel that in the story because 96 was here and down here. And I mean, it was spread out all over the place. So one of the things Sam did when I just showed him the printout is he just took all the 96 stuff, put it in one place, and then suddenly you had drama because that was the pivotal year. So that's one thing I'll do sometimes is I'll just make a printout. You can do it on screen too, but I find it easier with paper to be able to see it all at once is just highlight all the time elements, days, years, months, even hours or minutes, if it's that kind of piece, maybe.
Yeah, this goes back into the first episode that we did where we suggested the simple act of printing out a story. It's such an analog thing to do, but printing it out, perhaps printing it in a different fonts or changing the from serif to sans serif and narrowing the columns. It makes you, there's something about the combination of looking at it in front of you that's not a screen, and also the tactile nature of having it in your hands. It just makes you read it in a completely different way.
Yes, yeah.
Fresh perspective.
Yeah.
So when you guys plot out structure, I mean, sometimes I even think that I'm using chronological order as a crutch, but it works, And sometimes if I have something that's confused, frankly, I'll often see, can we impose chronological structure on it? Because maybe that'll solve the problems, which I guess is maybe good and bad. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm big on that. If someone I may have said this in one of our previous episodes, but if someone were to closely examine a lot of my work, they would probably see a very beginning of something. So like I had an editor who described it as like, we're looking for the Johnny Appleseed moment. Like when did this thing, whatever this thing was, when did it first begin? Like what was the moment of origin, the birthplace, the Big Bang, the whatever. And then we describe that vividly, and then we describe how it's become what it is today in the next section, like that kind of thing. So, and it's a nice, clean, chronological way in some ways to do it. I mean, you are quite literally beginning at the very beginning of this thing. It could, it also depends obviously on, what necessarily it is. And if it's a person and it's, what exactly story are you trying to tell about them and where that begins, so to speak. But I tend to be very interested in that also because if I'm trying to understand a person or a theme or whatever, I want to understand kind of the evolution of how it became what it is now. And so my reporting bears that out a lot. So sometimes I do feel, as Steve said, that it's a crutch for me, the kind of like going back to the very, very, very beginning, and sometimes starting that way. At least I have to get that way sometimes on paper for a draft before we tear it apart and make something better out of it. But yeah, the chronological, begin at the beginning is something I think about sometimes probably more than I should.
The variation, the story that Kevin talked about, we were talking about the chef with his restaurant, that technically begins with the ending. I mean, it opens with him, the night of the restaurant opens. But once it does that, it does go back to the beginning. And then just stays in order.
That is something that is almost, in the same way that Baxter talks about his narratives, that structure is a crutch, might be for him. That is a crutch for me as well, is that if you were to plot it out, alphabetically, a lot of my story starts T, U, V, W, X, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way,
Yeah.
and then Y, Z. And like
Wow.
that is something that I've noticed. That's something that I just, you know, gravitate to, which is
And that's not a problem.
right. And it's actually both a destination and a journey, because we're not quite telling you what the journey is, but we're giving you a hint of where, you know, the peripheries of the journey. But then we go back and then explain the journey story.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, actually, Kevin, I remember when we discussed that story, because you called me one night, and I remember I had just gotten home from work, and you said, I'm working on this story, and you'd been working on it for more than a year.
Yep.
And I remember during the course of our conversation, I took my tie off because I had just gotten back, you know, and you proposed some sort of structure. I can't even duplicate what you were suggesting, but it wasn't what you just said. I'm going to use that, by the way. I started TUV. You know, it was
Right.
some crazy structure with, I don't know, time travel and flashbacks and stuff. And when we kind of talked through and arrived at what you eventually came up with. But one of the things I pointed out, because I've always got to use musical analogies, is, oh yeah, I know what the issue is. You didn't like the idea of using the standard format, the standard, structure.
Mm.
And so one of the things I told you to try to encourage you was Mozart did not invent any musical forms. Okay, he didn't invent the concerto. He didn't invent opera or the symphony, the sonata. Someone else, those had already been invented. So he used these forms that were he took them off the shelf, that everyone else was using. He just used them better than anyone else.
Yep.
But he didn't create any forms. Other musicians in history have been credited with creating forms. He didn't create any forms. He used existing, like I say, off the shelf formulas.
Yeah.
But look what he did with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
BB King became a millionaire just, playing the 12-bar blues, the same chord structures over and over and over again, right?
Basically, yeah,
Doing it
it's
so
what you
well.
do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should give some context about that particular story, because I was working on this story, and as with now that enough time has passed, I think I feel comfortable with saying that I think the editor and I might not have seen eye to eye on that particular story. It wasn't as bad as I might have remembered it, but anyway, I had called Steve, and this is one of the great things about Steve, and I know that you, Baxter, and a number of other of our journalist friends have done this with Steve. It's just that he has availed himself to let us give him a call and talk about the story. And I have to say that 95% of how that story turned out, which ran the Chicago Tribune, and of course that Steve works at the LA Times, is Steve doing. So
Well,
I am forever indebted for you for that.
One of the interesting things, thank you, that's very kind. One very interesting thing about that story, by the way, talk about tension, is there is a hugely dramatic event in that piece. And Kevin, even though people may not have read it, I'm going to give it away anyway, because it's so powerful. There is a murder in that piece. Well, actually, I won't tell you who, but there is there's a murder-suicide in that story. And in a lot of editors, and I'm glad that your Tribune editors didn't ask for this, there's no hint of that whatsoever up top. It's not hinted at the headline. It's not hinted at in the, when it comes, it comes. And I thought that was a wonderfully bold choice to hold that back, because a lot of people would feel compelled. Oh, that's a real sexy thing. We got to tell them there's a murder coming.
You know what? Actually, it is there, but this is
Really?
you're doing, Steve, because so the story is, again, it's about the chef's relationship with this his home economics teacher, essentially. Now we're really giving it away, right? Who becomes a surrogate mother of his, right? And near the top of the story, it says that she was there for him, during his time in junior high, during something else, and before and after the murder. And it was just one line.
That's right.
And then after that, I just left it. But actually, that was, I believe, a choice that you told me to make. It just comes out of
Just
nowhere,
enough.
but it doesn't say who it is, right? So it's near the top of the story. And I'm presuming you're taking a look at it right now.
I'm looking at it right now. Yeah, she kept
There
an
you
eye
go.
on him during his travails through family turmoil before and after the murder. They cried on the phone with each other. But yeah, we don't know who.
It's supposed to be like, what, what the hell? And that actually goes to the point that Baxter was making earlier about tension. Now there is something at stake because for the reader, and you're thinking, what the hell? Like just the word murder dropped into a story about a chef opening up a restaurant. But then, that line, and I am 98% certain that was a choice that you convinced me to make. Steve.
Yeah, you're right. We did kick around, and I suggested just give a hint, but don't give it all away.
Right.
And how can, when you read that line, how can you not want to keep going? I mean, that's the, and
it's like,
it's great. It's great.
Murder. This is in the food section, and
Exactly.
But the other thing is,
Right.
we talked about focusing techniques. I remember, Kevin, as you described this story about this guy found family through cooking, found a family. But then the huge irony is he lost a family because he spent so much time working on opening the restaurant, he ignored his own marriage, and his relationship with his wife went to hell.
Yeah.
And so it's really a fascinating story of family, how cooking gave him a family, but also his obsession with cooking cost him a family. So talk about a narrative arc, it's got a lot going on there. But yeah, we did signal the murder. But I do remember, Kevin, when you called, you could not tell me what the story was about.
Yeah.
Right.
I've been there too. We've all been there with, we've all been there with Steve, where Steve, I believe me, Steve is used to this. Kevin, I have done that with Steve many a time. I can't even describe the story. And eventually at some point in our conversation, Steve will say, here's what the story is. And he'll say one or two sentences, and it's all of a sudden the fog is cleared. I can see everything. It's So I don't know how many times you said that line, Steve.
Let's actually sort of wrap up with this particular point here. Is that how do you actually identify what the story is? And I know for someone like me who lived with a story for a year and can't tell the heads from tails. And then after 15 minutes of talking to you, Steve, you said, that's the story right here. This is the story. It's about someone running away from his family, running away to cooking to escape his family. But the Shakespearean tragedy is that cooking, this was the exact line, how food, I'm trying to remember this now. It was something how food exacted a price, and then it's been so.
Did the food become his family? He lost a family and found one, or
it was something like that.
You want me to read your nut graph for you real fast?
Please, Steve.
This is a story. This is a story of a small town kid who proved himself in the big city, of connections forged and lost on the path to becoming the best, no matter the cost, of closing your eyes and hoping your problems disappear. It's a story of a chef and what cooking gave him and what it took away.
That's it, right?
Mostly, it's a story about family.
Yeah.
It's great.
And Steve was the one who said what cooking gave him and what cooking took away. That was it. And so, again, I'm forever indebted to you for that. But I want to know, when you're talking through with writers, and what are you looking for to identify that story right there? Are there any sort of giveaways?
Sure. Well, first of all, it wasn't 15 minutes. We were on the phone a long time. I remember that. What I'm looking for is, first of all, for what we started off talking about. Is there a journey? Is there some sort of transformation? Emotional journey, physical journey, psychological journey. So I'm looking for that when I'm listening to people describe this kind of thing. The other thing I'm listening for is to see if while they're talking to me, if they just keep repeating certain words, if not literally the word, if they keep repeating certain ideas. So talking to you that night, although you talked about the murder and his time as a kid and his travels to Colorado and the restaurant and all this stuff, the word family kept popping up again and again, whether referring to the family he got, through the home ec teacher, or what it cost him. So that just kept appearing again and again and again. I remember at the Times a story working with Hector Becerra, who's our city editor now, about a woman whose son was killed in the first Iraq War. And supposedly it was a story about a budding activist and how she was going to try to fight against the war. But as Hector talked to me about her and what she was going through, every other word out of his mouth was God, church, faith, and religion. And I said, Hector, this is not a story about an activist. This is a story about, I said, we boiled it down to 3 words: wrestling with God. Because she was very upset and angry with God. And in fact, I remember one of the great quotes was, she said something like, I stopped praying because I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to ask him for something when he knows I'm angry with him. And so what I thought made the story really profound was she didn't turn her back on religion. She just was kind of in a, sulking. She was just kind of, just disenchanted with it, but she hadn't given up her faith. She hadn't lost it. So anyway,
that's so good.
So he kept just saying, like I said, I was just listening to him, just the way I heard you just kind of say family, mom, dad, over and over again. Like I say, just God kept coming out of Hector's mouth. And finally I said, I think God's your story. So part of it is listening for if there's one theme that emerges more than others. And then the other thing I'm looking for is there, as Baxter was saying, some sort of journey. And I'm also looking for the verbs. I'm looking for when people are talking, are they describing scenes that they could, describe, whether they witnessed them or they could recreate them based on reporting. That's hope that answers the question. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Baxter,
it's easier when I'm not encumbered by the reporting. See, because I don't know what you guys know. So I don't have this static. I just hear, more pure information, and it's easier to sift through it because I don't have as much information to sift through.
Right. If you weren't a great writing coach and editor, you should consider being a therapist, Steve. I think you're really good at that.
That is what editors are.
Yeah. So just to wrap things up, Baxter, any just things you look forward to when you're I'm sure you work with a lot of like young writers, and when you're trying to identify story, besides all those the aforementioned things you talk about tensions and journeys, what makes you think, that's a story right there?
Yeah, and I will say this right off the bat. I think if you're able to identify what the story is, in some ways, a narrative will in some ways start to reveal itself. So once I've identified that, like, it could be like how, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches became so popular around the NBA. Like if you identify it, then you could start to see like the narrative of like, all right, this is a journey to figure this out. What are the things I look for? I mean, Steve taught me, as he probably taught you early on, about like this spark. It's this little, like this feeling of like, I want to know a little bit more about that. And those are kind of the once I feel that spark, then I feel like there's a little bit of story there. It tends to be something I don't know anything about, or I want to know a little bit more about, or, something like that. Those are the things that identify. I'm trying to think of a way to explain it. I mean, it's hard. Look, as Kevin, I'm sure as you've done, and Steve, as you've done a million times, like where we speak to college classes or something like that. And it's like, how do you get that question? How do you come up with story ideas? And oftentimes, like if I'm listening to someone, or I'm interviewing someone, or even if I'm reading something, there can be something in there that's a little bit of a spark. I'm like, I want to know a little bit more about that. I feel like I don't know anything about that, but that seems interesting. And maybe it's right in front of this person's face the whole time. So those are some of the ways that I think about it. And again, I mean, I could walk through like specific examples of how like, I think there's actually a story here or something like that. There's times, Kevin, you've done this, where you go down a path, you think there might be a story there, you kind of explore it a little bit, and you find out the pool's rather shallow. It's not like a deep pool that you can go swimming in, so to speak.
Or you find it's a story, but it's not a narrative. I mean,
exactly.
It's just a real cool story, but it doesn't, not all features have to be narratives, although there might be little scenes within them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it could be a quick news story. Like I think, you Steve, you talked about at the beginning, like the 300-word story. And I think, we've probably all seen some of the amazing feature stories that have come out of the then St. Petersburg Times, then and now Tampa Bay Times over the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever. The culture that in that place is amazing. But I feel like they had a time where, and maybe it's still happening, where everybody had to write 300-word brights. And maybe it was like they had one in the paper once a day. And I've seen some of them, and they're works of art in 300 words, like telling the story of a toll booth operator or something like that, like what their day is like.
Do you remember the famous one, the Rooster attacking the boy? I think Kelley Benham is the reporter who wrote that.
Oh, I've heard of this. I've never read it.
Yeah,
it's supposed to be great.
We'll link it below here, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
but those Kevin, I'm giving a rambling, terrible answer that if I had a good editor, maybe Steve would edit it down. But again, I lean on some of Steve's advice in terms of identifying story. It tends to be a spark, something I know nothing about, a whole world I didn't know existed, or a side of someone that has gone underreported and is behind the scenes. And I think us all the storytellers, we want to tell people something they don't know, or introduce them just to somebody they don't know, or something that's, has to be, news is new, has to be something that's different and new. So that is a huge driving force behind it. And then last thing I'll say is, as I said before, once I kind of identify and do a little pre-reporting or whatever the case may be on whatever that thing is that's new, a narrative can kind of start to appear. Maybe it's how someone tells me the story, and they're almost doing some of the work for me and explaining what the structure could be like, of how this got from point A to point B. The way that you phrased it earlier, of like, TUVW, and then XY, then you back up. I have done that. When you said it, I got flashbacks of a million stories that I've used that exact structure in, and it works so well. It's such a great way. I don't think it's a crutch either. If it works, it works. Like, I don't think, like, the hamburger is a great burger. I mean, it's timeless for a reason. We don't have to reinvent it. So, I mean, you could dress it up different ways. But anyways, that's a really long answer to your question. But I'm interested in what
Kevin, I got two quick bits of advice on this score to wrap up from me. First is to recommend a book you gave me, which really influenced me. I had to look it up here. Save the Cat. Save the Cat. I love the title. Save the Cat, the last book on screenwriting you'll ever need, by Blake Snyder, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, I understand.
Yeah.
Save the Cat. The title comes from the tension point of a Bruce Willis movie, where the issue is whether he saves the cat, right? Anyway, I have no interest in becoming a screenwriter, but it's such a fascinating, clear explanation of how scripts are written, and of tension points and structure. And he's very funny too. I found that extremely useful, and you were kind enough to send that to me. The other thing is, I would encourage people to become students of structure. See, here's the thing. Usually when we admire a piece of writing, we're admiring the words, and you say someone, oh, love that sentence, or, oh, what a clever word to use. I mean, we really, as writers, tend to focus on that. I don't think you hear a lot of people say, hey, loved your structure. You know what I mean? And so I think as we read, just as we're reading to appreciate, the style and the voice and all that we can get better at structure ourselves if we start paying attention to the structures that we see people like Gary Smith and other people use, and then learn from those things. But so I think as long as we're students students of writing, students of wordcraft, if we become students of structure, I think that would be a useful thing that we tend to just ignore.
That's excellent. Well, we are wrapping up, or we are at a time here. I promise next time we're not going to be talking about my story. There's a couple of stories I want to deep dive of Baxter's. He wrote a story about Kinston, North Carolina, and also his James Beard Award-winning story about the NBA's obsession with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We will dive into that in one of our future episodes. But for now, Baxter, Steve, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. If you like what you're seeing, please tell a friend about this. And, we love doing this. We love talking about writing. And, I know, speaking for Baxter, we would not be here if not for Steve. So thanks so much for your time and your tutelage. So, all right, until next time, thanks for watching the Steve Padilla Sessions.